I was asked to do a training video on human origins for the Arizona Museum of Natural History, where I volunteer weekly. The museum is located in downtown Mesa, so come with me and follow the tracks into the entrance here, and we will head to the Origins Gallery where we will begin. This is our current display for volunteers, where we cover human evolution from about 3.5 million years to present. While it doesn't include all species involved, it gives us a pretty good representation of ape to human transition. One thing that's very important is to tailor your presentation to the group that you're speaking to. We give a short, basic presentation to children on field trips. Sometimes we get groups of adults, though, who would schedule a tour of the museum, and I might give as long as a 15-minute presentation. Always keep in mind the age level and the interest level of the people that you're presenting to. I like to start with Lucy, not only because she's the oldest hominin fossil on the table, but also because of name recognition. A lot of adults have heard of Lucy, and she was one of the most famous fossils ever discovered. Lucy was an upright walking ape who lived 3.2 million years ago in what's now East Africa. She was definitely still an ape, but walked on 2 feet just like us. She still had long arms and curved fingers, which shows she was somewhat adapted to climbing and living in trees, and therefore transitional. Another fun fact is she was named after the Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. I like to point out that Lucy definitely wasn't a chimp. We had a common ancestor with chimpanzees around 6 to 7 million years ago, but we definitely did not evolve from them. They've been evolving as long as we have. We have a modern chimp skull on hand at the museum, and we can show the differences in dentition as well as the location of the foramen magnum at the base of the skull. The foramen magnum is where the spinal cord enters the skull. On modern chimpanzees, it's located near the rear of the skull and at an angle backwards. On Lucy's skull, it's located further forward, closer to modern humans, and angles straight down like later species of hominins. Her species also shows other indicators of bipedalism, like the shape of the pelvis and the angle of the femur. While we don't have a skull or fossils of Ardipithecus cadaba, we do have Artie on the wall. I like to show that Artie is 4.4 million years old versus Lucy being 3.2 million years old, and ask people, especially the kids, if they can tell the difference in the feet. They usually get it pretty quickly. Ardipithecus not only has a slightly smaller brain, but it has a feet with an opposable big toe. That means Ardipithecus was slightly more adapted to moving around in trees. The Smithsonian Human Origins website is an excellent reference for learning the basics about a lot of these species. I would suggest to anybody interested in giving presentations or just learning more about it, check them out on a regular basis. They talk here about how Australopithecus afarensis had both ape and human characteristics. Members of this species had ape-like face proportions, a flat nose, strongly projecting lower jaw, and brain case with a small brain, usually less than 500 cubic centimeters. So, along with strong arms, curved fingers, they were still adapted for climbing around in trees. They had small canine teeth, though, like other early humans, and a body that stood on 2 legs and regularly walked upright. Definitely showing traits of earlier apes and species that came later, showing how transitional they actually are. Next up is Australopithecus africanus. The particular skull that we have at the museum is called Mrs. Plez. Now, this skull was discovered in 1947 by Robert Broom and John T. Robinson in Sterkfontein, South Africa. The discovery of this nearly complete cranium of a mature specimen led to a much more positive reception of South African Australopithecus as hominids. Compared to earlier Australopithecines, Africanus had a larger brain, more rounded skull, absence of a cranial crest, and smaller front teeth, getting just a little bit closer to becoming human. Some of the key points from the Smithsonian site talk about how it still had a combination of human-like and ape-like features. Compared to afarensis, africanus had a rounder cranium housing, a larger brain, smaller teeth, but it still had ape-like features including relatively long arms and a strongly sloping or projecting face that juts out from underneath the brain case with a pronounced jaw. The pelvis, femur, and foot bones show that they walked bipedally on 2 feet, but its shoulder and hand bones indicate they were still adapted for climbing, still very transitional in between earlier apes and later humans. Next up, we have Homo habilis. The skull that we have is KNMER 1813. It was discovered in 1973 at Kubifora, Kenya, and described by Richard Leakey in Nature the same year. Not everyone agrees about the classification of some of the Homo habilis skulls, because what we see is a lot of variation at the time, and there some have more ape-like features, others slightly human, but they lived at about the same time. The Smithsonian page on Homo habilis says this species, one of the earliest members of the genus Homo, has a slightly larger brain case and smaller face and teeth than an Australopithecus or older hominin species, but it still retains some ape-like features, including long arms and moderately projecting face. Its name, which means handyman, was given in 1964 because it was thought that they were the first stone tool makers. Currently, the oldest stone tools are dated slightly older than the evidence of genus Homo. Although Homo habilis may or may not have been the first tool maker, I like to bring up the stone tools at that time, and because we know that they're definitely associated with their species. We have a plastic replica of an Oldowan style tool at the museum, and it dates from about the time of Homo habilis. I like to let older children or adults hold it in their hand, pass it around while I'm talking to them, to see what it would be like to hold a tool 2 million years ago. Next up is Homo erectus with the Dmanisi skull number 3. The Dmanisi Homo erectus was discovered in 1999 in Dmanisi, Georgia. This demonstrates that hominins had left Africa by 1.8 million years ago. While body proportions of Homo erectus were close to modern humans, early brain size was still close to Homo habilis. The Dmanisi skull for Homo erectus that we have at the museum even shows very similar features to Australopithecus africanus from a few 100,000 years before. The Smithsonian page on Homo erectus mentions that early African Homo erectus fossils, sometimes called Homo ergaster, are the oldest known early humans to have possessed modern human-like body proportions with relatively elongated legs and shorter arms compared to the size of torso. Those features are considered adaptations to a life lived on the ground, indicating the loss of earlier tree climbing adaptations with the ability to walk and possibly run long distances. So again, real transition there with early Homo erectus. They also mention that the appearance of Homo erectus in the fossil record is often associated with the earliest hand axes, the first major innovation in stone tool technology. And just like with the Oldowan style tool, we have a plastic replica of a hand axe there at the museum. And again, I like to give it to the older kids, let them pass it around, or the adults, and let them know that Homo erectus is the first species to create an all-purpose tool called the hand axe, which can be used for chopping, scraping, digging, can be resharpened by striking new edges. All species of human that came later used this same tool. The Neanderthal skull is probably the most popular thing on the table, at least with adults now. A lot of news lately about how people living outside of Africa have up to 4% Neanderthal in their genomes. A lot of people have had their genetic testing done, and they'll tell me what percent they have. I'm 1.5%. I would have thought it was higher, but I had my testing done a little over a year ago, and that's what they told me. The skull we have at the museum is the Lafarassi 1. Discovered in France in 1909, Lafarassi is considered to be a classic Neanderthal, having features that best present the features of its anatomy, including a low-vaulted cranium with projecting face, a low forehead, pronounced double brow ridge, wide cheekbones, weak chin, heavily worn out front teeth, a substantial nasal opening, and a very large brain capacity. It's about 50,000 years old too, so it's actually one of the later Neanderthals, and it really shows all the real traits that are associated with that species. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia from 400,000 years ago to about 35,000 years ago. To compare them with us, they had a shorter average height, thicker limbs, conical rib cage, more barrel-chested, thicker hand bones, wider pelvis, and shorter lower leg. In fact, a lot of the difference in them anatomically, why they were shorter, was in their lower leg. Their lower arms are also shorter than ours. It's interesting. A lot of that is thought, though, to be adaptations to living in the cold. If you're short and stocky, you tend to retain heat and not radiate heat as much as somebody that's tall and thin. They talk about this on the Smithsonian page for the Neanderthals. Neanderthals are our closest extinct human relative. Some defining features of their skulls include the large middle part of the face, angled cheekbones, and a huge nose for humidifying and warming cold, dry air. Their bodies were shorter and stockier than ours, another adaptation to living in cold environments. But their brains were just as large as ours and often larger, proportional to their brawnier bodies. The larger nasal opening is also thought to be an adaptation to breathing colder air. We know that they were very much like us and not the dumb brutes that people once thought they were. For early Homo sapiens, we have the Hurto skull discovered in Hurto, Ethiopia in 1997. The Hurto skull shows a large cranial capacity and is thought to be a subspecies of human who went extinct, but it could also be just natural variation among our species at the time. While this skull has large brow ridges, the rest of the skull is shaped just like modern humans today, and I'll often hold up the modern human skull next to it, and turn them both around just to show that they basically are the exact same shape. That's one of the reasons we have the modern skull there, so you can pick it up at any time and show differences or similarities between it and other species. So we've gone all the way across the front of the table now, and then I like to jump to the back and talk about the robust Australopithecines. The robust Australopithecine we have on display is Paranthropus boisei from eastern Africa, discovered in 1959. Boisei is characterized by a specialized skull with adaptations for heavy chewing, a strong sagittal crest in the midline of the top of the skull anchored the temporalis muscles from the top and side of the brain case to the lower jaw, and thus moved the massive jaw up and down. It was a skull designed for crushing and chewing. And just like with Lucy, we can also tell that Paranthropus walked upright by the location of the foramen magnum facing straight down in the middle of its skull. I like to compare the jaw and teeth of Paranthropus with early Homo erectus, since they lived at exactly the same time. This is also a great time to get the kids involved again and ask them if they've learned what the scientific name for an animal that just eats plants is. Every now and then you hear vegan, but most of the time they get it right. Herbivore. This is also a good time to point out that while Paranthropus had a head and face about the same size as the Neanderthal, his brain was tiny compared to them and more in line with earlier species like Lucy and Australopithecus afarensis. The Smithsonian page can give you a lot more details, but it's important at this point to show that they are an offshoot. They weren't on the line of evolution that went to us, and they probably had a common ancestor like Lucy or maybe a species or two before us, but they diverged and went in a separate direction based on their diet and their environment. Next up is another offshoot, one of my favorites, the more recently discovered Homo naledi, discovered in 2013 and described by Lee Berger in 2015. A lot of people that come to the museum have never even heard of Homo naledi yet. In November 2013 and March 2014, over 1,550 specimens, pieces that is, from at least 15 Homo naledi individuals were recovered from the Rising Star cave system in South Africa. This excavation remains the largest collection of a single hominin species that has been found in Africa, and they're actually still bringing up more down there today. Here's paleoanthropologist Lee Berger having a little fun showing you the size difference between modern humans and Homo naledi. Also shows the Rising Star cave and the fossils that they brought up. They made this discovery in the same area as his discovery of Australopithecus sediba. This is a chart that we have on the table at the museum that shows how they were basically half Australopithecus and half Homo, genus, us. From the waist up, they had a small head, narrow shoulders, small barrel chest, long arms and curved fingers, but their legs and their feet were almost just like modern humans. You almost couldn't get closer to half of one species and half of another. The site that they were found in was way back in a chamber in an underground cave system where you had to really squeeze to get back into. And it doesn't look like they were trapped in a cave. It looked like they were placed in a cave almost as in a burial site. There's still a complete series on the discovery of Homo naledi by National Geographic on YouTube. So just type in Lee Berger Homo naledi if you want to learn more about it. I'd encourage anybody who wants to volunteer to learn about it, but I also mention this to people that seem real interested. I tell them if you want to learn more about it, just go to YouTube, type in Lee Berger Homo naledi, and you can watch the entire series for free. It's really important if children show an interest in paleontology or anthropology to encourage them, because we do need people in the next generation to keep looking for these fossils. So if they show an interest in it, give them the resources that they need to find out more about it. The last fossil skull we have on the table is what I believe to be another offshoot. They call this Homo floresiensis, was discovered in 2003 on the island of Flores in Indonesia. We know that they use primitive stone tools. We have fossils as old as 700,000 years ago. Skull fossils as recent as 60,000 years ago, but artifacts associated with them at 50,000 years. Adults were only 3.5 feet tall, but their feet were almost as large as ours. So you're talking about a 3.5 foot tall little guy with feet about 70 to 80% the size of ours. That's one of the reasons they nicknamed him the Hobbit. Now on the museum poster there, we have a little, Hobbit there is from the movie, just as kind of a joke, but it sure gets people's attention. This is the cave where the fossils were found in on the island of Flores. When the Hobbit was first discovered, there were 3 different hypotheses. One group thought that it was maybe island dwarfism, Homo erectus possibly even, that when larger mammals sometimes become smaller in a restricted environment like on islands. So that was one hypothesis. Disease was another hypothesis. But the third one, that it was a split, an earlier split, is the one that seems to be supported by recent study. So it looks like it was Homo habilis or something similar to Homo habilis that ended up leaving Africa probably at least 1 million years ago and ended up in Indonesia and just remained isolated until about 50,000 years ago, until we showed up. So that's all the fossils that we have on the table, but there is a sign I put up next to the table that I made a little over a year ago that talks about the distribution of the genus Homo between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. We used to think it was a ladder-like type evolution from one species to the next, but now we know that at any given time there were many different types of species, and this old march of progress kind of thing where one species to the next is just not the way it was. Originally people thought that because there were just so few fossils found. Now on that map there's a question mark with the Denisovans next to it, so you might get some questions about that. The reason I have a question mark is we really don't know a lot about what they looked like. We have a lot of genetic information though. They were kind of the eastern cousin of the Neanderthals, and based on accumulated genetic differences, it looks like one of the genomes we have lived about 65,000 years before the other. All we really have is some teeth and finger bone. We know, though, genetically that they left Africa by 550,000 years ago. And just like if you're European, you have up to 4% Neanderthal DNA in your genome, Southeast Asians have up to 5% Denisovan DNA. So the name Homo denisova has been suggested for this species, but no name has been officially assigned to them yet. We do know that they're a little bit closer to Neanderthals than us, but at this point still considered a separate species. There was, however, a hybrid. It looks like a first generation hybrid that was recently discovered. The genome of a young girl was completed, and it shows that her mother was Neanderthal and her father was Denisovan. There is another artifact on the table that I like to show the kids. It's called the Farpoint Clovis spearpoint. Now it's 11,000 years old. It was found in Malibu, California. And the reason I like to bring it up a lot is when you walk into the museum, there are mammoths and mastodons full size on display, and I like to tell them this is the kind of spear point that would have been used on the end of a long stick, that early man would have used to hunt mammoths and mastodons. It also shows advanced stone tool technology compared to the hand axe and the earlier Oldowan style tools. So to wrap up the training video, I want to show a series of images from a Smithsonian video they recently did called 7 Million Years of Human Evolution. And what it stresses, and what I'd really like to stress, is that at no one time was there like one species alive. Going back as far as we see in human evolution, there were always several different types of species alive at any one time. Until, of course, the Neanderthals died out around 35,000 years ago. Here at 1.8 million years ago, when we're really seeing the transition from ape to human, there were a lot of very closely related species around. There would have actually been more species alive at this time when they're showing right here, like Homo naledi would have been around. We just don't have fossil evidence for it, but obviously their ancestors would have been there. And while species did leave Africa a lot at different times, the cradle of humankind, the focus of where most of the evolution took place was actually in Africa. We see small percentage of genome contributed from species that were from outside of Africa, but their ancestors also came from Africa. So if you're interested in volunteering for the Arizona Museum of Natural History, you can contact them through their website at arizonamuseumofnaturalhistory.org, or you can call the front desk during business hours. If you don't live in the Arizona area and you'd like to volunteer for a museum, I highly suggest that too. It's just a very rewarding experience. I've learned a lot myself in preparing for volunteering, and also learned a lot about a lot of topics at the museum I wasn't near as familiar with before I started to volunteer there.